So hello everyone. My name is Jeroen Vinke. I am in the Aurelia Core Team, where my focus is on the Aurelia CLI. It's what I spend most of my time on. I build features for it, I fix bugs, and sometimes I introduce bugs, but okay, that's not something I'm proud of, but it happens. I'm also on the Aurelia UI Toolkits team. It is a team of 4 people. We have built a CanUI bridge, a materialized bridge. We've helped Syncfusion in building their own bridge. So you can use Aurelia with Syncfusion and use data binding, that kind of stuff. There's also a grid that's built entirely on top of Aurelia, which is called vGrid. You can install that and use it. It's pretty cool. And we're working on integration with Auth0, which is authentication framework. We're trying to make that easier so that you can use Auth0 in Aurelia much more easily. And we do that as part of the Aurelia Identity project. So that's something we're working on, and we're hoping to show something of that soon. Right, so let's talk about the CLI. What is the CLI? CLI is a command line tool. You install it through npm. You use it by using the au command. It is a bundler, so there's an integrated bundler in the CLI. So when you use require.js or system.js as a module loader, you will use the internal bundler of the Aurelia CLI. It is also a project generator. So you can generate Aurelia projects using the CLI. And the most important thing is that you can choose the technology that you like. And I've made a slide which shows all the technology that you can choose from. And the cool thing is that you can pick and choose which ones you want to use. So you can say, I want to use Sass and I want to use System.js. And the CLI will create a project for you that has that already pre-configured. So you don't have to mess around with the configuration files, stuff like that. You can choose Sass and Webpack if you prefer Webpack and not System.js. You can say, I want to use ASP.NET Core, and it will create a .NET Core application for you. It will create a program CS, startup CS, CS project, yeah, so you don't have to set it up. And last week we added Webpack support, which is pretty cool because yeah, it's pretty popular. Webpack, it's growing, and yeah, you can now generate projects using Webpack. So instead of the integrated Aurelia CLI bundler, it will use Webpack. So you can choose that. But most of this talk is going to be about the integrated Aurelia CLI bundler. All right, so I wanted to take a look at a project structure of a project that was generated by the CLI. So let's look at this one. So first of all, there are a bunch of configuration files. This was generated by the CLI. There is a Karma configuration file, because I chose Karma when I created the project. There is a Babel configuration file, which was also generated because I said I wanted to use Babel and not TypeScript. There's a test folder, and in here you can find your unit test, your specifications. There is a Aurelia Karma.js file in that folder, and this already makes sure that Karma can load the unit tests. So that's pretty useful to have. There's the source folder, and in here you have your HTML, your JavaScript. You can put your CSS in here, all that kind of stuff. Your application code is in there. There is a scripts folder, and by default the CLI will generate the bundles in the scripts folder. So in here you'll see the app bundle and the vendor bundle, and that is by default. You can create your own bundles, rename the bundles, whatever. And I'll show you where you can do that later. There's the Node modules folder, because this is a Node.js project. And there is an Aurelia project folder. And in this folder, there are a couple of other folders, and there's an aurelia.json file. But first, let's look at the environments folder. So in here are JavaScript files that have some environment-specific variables. So in here, in the dev.js, I mentioned that I want to do debugging and I want to do testing. In production, I don't want to use either of those things. And what happens is that when you do a build, for example, using au build or au run, it will copy the file that is specific to that environment to the source folder. Here you have an environment.js file, which was copied during build. So if you do a production build, it will copy prod.js to environment.js. But if you do a development build, then it copies dev.js to environment.js. And that's pretty useful because you can use it in your application code. If we take a look at main.js, we see that it imports the environment JavaScript file, and it uses that to determine whether to enable development logging and where to load the testing plugin. So that's pretty useful if you want to change application startup based on the environment. There's also a generators folder, and in here are generators for a bunch of different types of components. I mean, you can generate an attribute, a custom attribute, or you can generate a binding behavior or an element, a custom element. And you can call those using au generate, and then the name of the generator that you want to use. So if I want to generate an element, I say au generate an element. And in a few seconds, it will ask what I want to name it. So if I name it test, then it said it created test, and it will put it in the resources folder, in the source folder. There's a resources folder and there's an elements folder, and in here it has created the custom element. So this is basically a quick way to create new custom elements, new attributes without having to write this code yourself. So there's also a tasks folder, and in here are the Gulp tasks of your application. And it's actually Gulp 4, so you can use promises and stuff like that. So it's the newest version of Gulp. And I'll explain a bit more about Gulp tasks in a second. I just want to show you the Aurelia.json file, which is in the Aurelia project folder. And this large file has all kinds of settings. For example, it has it mentions which bundler to use, and in this case it uses the integrated bundler of the CLI. If you were to choose Webpack, it would say use the Webpack bundler. Here you have settings for the build. So you can say I want to do minification, I want to do source maps. Here are the bundle configurations. It's all in aurelia.json. So that's basically what a project structure of Aurelia looks like when you generate it with the CLI. So I mentioned the tasks folder. In there are the Gulp tasks, as I've mentioned, and you can call them using the au command. So if you want to run the build Gulp task, then you do au build. If you want to run the test Gulp task, you run au test. Which means that you can also create your own Gulp tasks and execute them via the au command. And I've done this in a project, and I wanted to show you what I did. So in here is I'll close this. In here, I have created a hello Gulp task because I'm an original, so I use hello world. And what it does is when you execute it, it either says hello world, or it says hello and whatever you provided through a flag. And you execute it like this, au hello, which is the name of the file. And I want to specify a text, everyone. And after a second, it will show hello everyone. Okay, so that is the Gulp task, and you can create your own Gulp task for whatever you like, for whatever thing you need to do in your build, in your development. But there's also a hello.json file, which is next to the hello.js file. And in here is basically metadata for the Gulp task. In here you can specify what the description is, what the name is, and what flags are supported by the Gulp task. And that's useful for because when you provide such JSON file, it will show up in au help. So when you run au help, you will see all of the commands that the CLI supports, including your custom Gulp tasks, which is useful if you're working in a team and you don't want to explain to everyone how to use a Gulp task. They can simply run au help and see what parameters are supported, what the Gulp task does, and those kind of things. So when I create a Gulp task, I would definitely also create a JSON file so that it shows up in au help. It's pretty useful. All right, so we already had a look at the aurelia.json file. And that JSON file is used in a bunch of different places, which is possible because it's a JSON file, so it's easily to import it in other Node.js files. For example, it is used by the bundler. The CLI bundler uses settings from the aurelia.json file. It is used by the Karma configuration file. It is used by the Gulp tasks. And if you have your own Node.js scripts, you can import aurelia.json as well and use settings from there. So it is basically a centralized configuration file for your entire project. And because the CLI doesn't touch aurelia.json, you can safely add your own settings to that file and use them wherever you like. So if we look at the project, and let's, for example, look at the process CSS Gulp task. We see that it imports aurelia.json, and we see that it uses the CSS processor.source property, which is useful because when you then want to change where the source is, you don't have to touch the Gulp tasks. You can simply open aurelia.json and modify that JSON file, which is much easier. It's also used by Karma config.js, for example. Here it loads aurelia.json, and it uses settings from aurelia.json. So it's really a centralized file, and you can use it wherever you want, which makes it easy because when you want to change your project setup, you only have to touch aurelia.json. So next I wanted to talk about the bundler. I have a few subjects I want to go through. So in addition to generating bundles, the CLI will also create a loader configuration. Because when you use the bundler of the CLI, you will either use required.js or system.js. And those module loaders have to be configured. And you don't see that immediately. You don't see a loader configuration anywhere. It's a bit hidden. And the bundler of the CLI generates that configuration for you. So you don't have to write a required.js configuration, or if you use system.js, a system.js configuration. The bundler basically generates that for you. And I'd like to show you where you can find that configuration. So by default, that configuration is added to the end of the vendor bundle. So here in the scripts folder are all the bundles, and in the vendor bundle we see at the very end a function which calls required.js.config. And that is the way to configure your module loader. And what you do is you pass in a loader configuration, which it does here. And I'll just make this a bit more readable because this isn't very useful. Like that. So this is what the configuration looks like. And like I said, the CLI generated this for you. You don't have to do this typing by yourself. And it generates it based on two types of information. The first one is settings in aurelia.json. Those you supply yourself. And the second type of information is it uses the bundle process. So when it encounters files it needs to bundle, it will also add entries to this configuration file. So it is a very dynamic way of configuring the loader. And yeah, you don't have to write it yourself. For example, in the paths here are a couple of paths that you can find in aurelia.json. For example, the root, resources, elements, attributes. They can be found in aurelia.json here. So when you want to create your path mappings, you simply add them to the aurelia.json and they will be passed to the loader indirectly. And the others in here are added by the CLI itself. So it is based on the bundling process that it finds these packages and adds them to the configuration. So I just wanted to show you that this happens. There is a loader configuration. I want to show you where it happens. So I don't think it's a magical process of there is a module loader and I didn't configure it. It is configured, but it happens underwater and it happens for you. So now you're aware. And next I wanted to show you a bit about the layout of a bundle. It basically has three sections, a prepend section, a dependency section, and an append section. And these are all optional, by the way. And what's useful here is that you can put scripts in the prepend section that you absolutely want to have loaded first. So before anything else in your bundle loads, you want the script to execute it. And that one you can put in the prepend section so that it executes first, before anything else. And the same thing about the append section. If you want to have a script executed last, then you add it in the append section. It will be added at the end of the bundle. So that is a very powerful way to structure your bundle. And you can actually see these sections in the Aurelia.json file. It's all in the Aurelia.json file, by the way. It's all there. But it's here we have the bundles. Here we have the app bundle configuration, which says I want to include the JavaScript. I want to include CSS and HTML. And here we have the vendor bundle. And in here you see a prepend section, a dependency section. And if we would have had an append section, you could have created it here. You can say append, and then whatever your script you want to have appended. But it's optional, so you don't have to supply it if you don't need it. For example, in the prepend section, you will see that it includes the required.js module loader. And we have added that to the prepend section because you want the loader to be loaded first. you don't want to have the modules at the top of the bundle. You want the loader to be loaded first, because that loads all the modules. Same thing for Bluebird. You want the promise implementation before anything else. So you add it to the prepend section. And in here you have the dependencies. These are basically all the packages that your application uses. So you define it in here so that when the CLI creates the bundles, it will add these packages to the vendor bundle. That's basically what a bundle looks like, and that is the same for an app bundle or vendor bundle or your own bundle. There's 3 sections that you can configure yourself. So when you do a AU build, which is the command to create the bundles, you will see that it does a bunch of tracings. For example, it traces the app, which is the app.js. It traces the environment.js, traces main.js. It traces all the packages that there are. And what tracing means is that a JavaScript file gets loaded, for example, app.js, it gets included into the bundle, and then it looks in the app.js for any import statements. If you have any import statements at the top of the file, it will include all those files in the bundle as well. It will trace those files. So it is a recursive process of adding files to the bundle. So, for example, this main.js. If this main.js file gets traced, it will include this file into the bundle, and it will also trace the environment.js file because it's imported here. Because when you have an import statement, it basically means that this file has a dependency on the environment.js file. So we need that in the bundle. And that is basically what tracing does.
Questions?
Yeah, sure.
So will it only include the part of the file which is needed, or just include the whole file?
It includes the whole file. Yeah. So we've already had a quick look at the dependency section of a bundle. And if you take a closer look at that section, you will see that there are 2 types of syntaxes that you can use. There is the shorter syntax on the left and the more larger syntax on the right. And there's a distinct difference between the 2. There are a few conditions that need to be met if you want to use the shorter syntax. For example, the library has to be in the node modules folder. The library needs to have specify a main file in its package.json file. And I'll show you in a second what that means. And it needs to be exported as a single file. If you have a library that exports multiple files, which you want to use, you cannot use the short syntax. So we have to use the more larger syntax for that. So for example, Aurelia framework is an example of a library that can be included using the short syntax, because in its package.json file, it mentions a main file. So that's a met condition. The second one is that it needs to be exported as a single file, which, well, there are 2 files, but you only need 1. So that's another condition that is met. And the Aurelia framework library is in the node modules folder. So that is met also. So the Aurelia framework can be included using the short syntax. But there are packages that can't, because, for example, if you take a look at Aurelia templating resources, it also specifies a main file in its package.json file. It is also in node modules, but it doesn't export itself as a single file. In here are a bunch of files. So that unfortunately means that you have to use the larger syntax, which it does. If you look at the aurelia.json file, you see that it uses the larger syntax. So if you can, use the shorter syntax because it's cleaner, less code. But if you can't, use the expanded syntax, and you can define all kinds of settings for the package, which is useful. So this is what a single dependency could look like. These are all valid properties that you can use. For example, the name, Bootstrap, and that is how you import it in your application code. So if you want to import Bootstrap, you write import Bootstrap with quotes and a semicolon, but okay. There's a path which points to the distribution folder of the package. And for Bootstrap, that is the node modules Bootstrap dist folder. There's also a main file, which is included in the bundle by default. And in later versions of the CLI, you can actually set the main file to false if a package does not have a main file. For example, Aurelia CLI does not have a main file. It has a bunch of different controls, but there isn't one file that is main. So you can set the main property to false, and that is now a valid configuration. The depth array is passed to the module loader. So in this case, when required.js will load Bootstrap, it will know, okay, I have a dependency on jQuery. So before I load Bootstrap, I need to load jQuery. So this is passed directly to the loader configuration that we saw earlier. There's also a resources array, which is pretty powerful. You can specify files that need to be included into the bundle. For example, CSS files, but also HTML files, JavaScript files that aren't included in the bundle by default. Because if you didn't specify this Bootstrap CSS file, it wouldn't be bundled. You have to specify that, okay, I want this CSS file, so bundle it. And you do that by specifying it in the resources section. There's also a package root property, which is fairly new, and you only have to use that one if you have a package that does not live in the node modules folder. Sometimes you have a package that you download manually and store in your project folder, but you don't put that in your node modules folder, you put that in a different one. And then you need to specify the package root, which is used to know where to look for a package.json file. So if you have a package outside of node modules, specify a package root. And the last one is also pretty cool because it specifies in which environments you need this dependency. And I have a good example of that, which is used by default. So in the Aurelia.json, there is an Aurelia testing library, and it specifies that it only needs to be used in the development environment. So that when you do your production build, the Aurelia testing library won't be bundled. So bundle becomes smaller, faster to load, that kind of stuff. And you can actually say, okay, I want to have it in development and in staging. And it will be included in either of those. And there's actually also optional, like most of the properties, you actually only need the name, path, and often a main property. The rest are optional. All right, so when you create a production build, it not only creates the bundles, the CLI, but it also does minification. And what it means is that it removes white space and all kinds of unnecessary code that makes the bundle larger than it needs to be, because in production you don't need spaces, you don't need to see the source code. So that is basically what minification does, and that happens after the bundles have been created. So if you create a development production build, whoa, which you do using AU build and prod, then not only will it create the bundles, but it also will minify them, so they are a bit smaller. So often you will see that it takes a bit longer to write to the bundles, and that is because of the minification step that happens for production. Yeah?
Is the minification the default for passing the prod flag, or is it something that you configure?
The minification, yeah, it happens by default for production builds. And you can actually modify it as well. And yeah, it is in Aurelia.json also. It's almost all in Aurelia.json. So in here you have a build section, and you can specify options. For example, I want to have source maps in development and staging. And you can supply your own minification options if you want. So you can say, I always want to do minification. And you do that by setting it to true. Or you can say, I want to have it in production. It's a very flexible syntax, and that makes it very powerful. But you can also say, okay, I don't need minification in development build, but I want to do it in staging and production, and I want to supply these minification options, because there are a lot of different options that you can supply for minification. The CLI uses a library called HTML minifier, and any option that is valid for HTML minifier you can supply here, and the CLI will use those settings when creating the minification, when doing minification. So that's pretty powerful, and you can do all kinds of crazy stuff, like I want to have some default minification options. So in here you can provide some default settings and override those in specific environments. You can do all kinds of crazy stuff. But by default, it does only minification in production. All right, so I wanted to talk a bit about path mappings, because often I see these crazy import statements like import customer from .. and you have to guess how many .. you need to get to where you want to be. Yeah, that is not awesome, and it makes your code a bit ugly, I think. And a cool way to solve this is to create a path mapping. So in here I created a path mapping for models, and that allowed me to use kind of like an absolute path instead of relative. So then the import syntax becomes much nicer. I wanted to show you how to create such path mapping, and I choose to do that in TypeScript, because you also have to do an optional additional step in TypeScript that you don't have to do in Babel. So I created a TypeScript project, and in here I have a beautiful folder structure, and in here I have a very long import statement. So this isn't that nice. I'd rather have models customer. Then TypeScript will complain. We'll fix that later. And what you want to do is in the aurelia.json file, which is in the Aurelia project, there is the paths section. And if you remember, these paths are passed to the module loader. So the module loader takes care of the path mappings. So in here you can specify, okay, I want models to point to the models folder. And this basically means that allows you to use an absolute syntax instead of a relative one, because the module loader solves those that mapping, and that will work. So it will find the module during runtime, but we still have TypeScript complaining, like cannot find modules customer. And that is because you have to tell TypeScript actually a similar kind of path mapping you have to configure for TypeScript. And you do that in the tsconfig.json. So in here you have the TypeScript settings. And here you can say paths. And this syntax is a bit weird. I always forget what the exact syntax is. I have to cheat. Yeah. So there is the paths property, and you have to say, okay, any file next to after model / resolves to source models and then the file. And then you also have to set the base URL. You have to set it to, you can set it to dot, which is the current directory, but you have to do it. It isn't optional if you use path mappings. So if you do it like this, Visual Studio still won't like it, but I believe if you reopen the file, it's happy, yay. So that's, yeah, that cost me a few hours, but okay. In addition to the syntax being very weird, so yeah, that is a bit difficult, but okay. But this is cool because, yeah, the import syntax is much nicer, and it cleans up your code a bit.
Does it play nicely with Webpack as well? Is there a similar configuration?
Yeah, I believe you can configure aliases. I believe it's called an alias.
Because in our projects we configure it top down, so to speak. So we configure TypeScript and Aurelia to always start from the roots of the project to make our import statements. So we
right.
don't have the dot /
All right.
we just always start from src to
right.
import stuff. So I was wondering if you could do something similar inside of Webpack.
Well, I know you can provide aliases, but I'm not sure if you can create a deeper structure. I believe that's what you're asking. I'm not sure.
Okay, I will.
Yeah, you have to play around with that.
I will Google it.
Yeah, and then tell me. Right. So how much time do we have? How much time? Yeah. All right.
We started a bit late.
Okay. So I wanted to talk about a more advanced subject, which is loader plugins. And I wanted to talk about this because there is a common error that you often see when using Aurelia CLI, which is the plugin.load is not a function error. And I wanted to explain what that means and why it shows you that and how to debug it and how to fix it. So first I'll explain a bit what a loader plugin does. So when you have an import statement in your application code, you can specify a JSON exclamation mark. You can prefix your file. And the JSON exclamation mark means I want to load this file using the JSON loader plugin. And what this means is that it doesn't come back as text. It comes back as a fully parsed JSON object. And when you have this import statement, the loader kicks in, it will load the data.json file, but it isn't parsed yet to JSON, it's just text. And what you can then do is use the JSON loader plugin. And what that plugin does is it parses the text to JSON, which is then returned from the loader to your application code. So the data variable in the import statement is now actually a fully parsed JSON object. You don't have to parse that string in your application code yourself. So that's pretty useful for lots of things. You can have CSS loader plugins. They exist for required.js and system.js, although the syntax of the import statement is a bit different. For system.js, you have /data.json !JSON, so it is appended instead of prefixed, but okay. And I created a project that uses such a loader plugin, and I set it up to fail, so that I can show you what is going on. So in here I have an app.js file. Oh, there. The other one here. Yeah. So this app.js, I inject the loader first of all, and then in attached I want to load a JSON file. And when I've loaded that JSON file, I convert it back to string again, and I show it in my view using data binding. And here you see the syntax again. This basically means I want to load test.json using the JSON loader plugin. And the test.json is fairly simple. Hello world again. And when I run this application, it won't work, but I'll show it anyway. So it does all the tracing, traces all the files, all the packages, that kind of stuff. And then it runs. But then I don't see the JSON because I have an error in my application code, which is plugin.load is not a function. Right after that, I see load timeout from modules and then the JSON file. And what this means is that it's trying to use the JSON plugin, but it isn't there. So at runtime, somehow that JSON plugin doesn't exist. And there's a good reason for that. If we take a look at the Aurelia.json, there is a loader section, and in there are all your settings for your loader. And here are the plugins. So the text plugin and a JSON plugin. And what you'll notice is that there is a stop property. And it wasn't clear to me right away what this stop property does. So I looked it up, and it basically means that if this stop property is set to true, then the plugin won't be bundled. And that is kind of like an optimization step for your bundle. So if you don't use the loader plugin at runtime, you don't fetch files after a page has loaded, that kind of stuff, or you load files that aren't in the bundle, then you can set stop to true, and your bundles become smaller and it loads faster. So what I tried to do here is I tried to load a file at runtime which isn't bundled yet. So because of that, required.js will go and try and fetch the file. And it will try to use the JSON plugin to parse that file to JSON. But because the stop property is set to true, the plugin doesn't exist at runtime. It has been stopped out. It's a simple function that doesn't do anything. It's much smaller, but it doesn't work at runtime. So I can fix it by setting stop to false, I have to do it for both plugins because they depend on each other. And that will cause the plugins to be bundled, and I can use that at runtime, which is a fine solution. But a much better solution is try and bundle the files that it tries to load. So in here, I should make sure that it loads, it puts the test.json in the bundle, so then it doesn't have to use the plugin. And you can set stop to true, and your bundle becomes smaller. Does that make any sense at all, or? Okay. So yeah, if you get the error, you can easily work around it by setting stop to false, or make sure that the file is going to be bundled. And then you won't have the error anymore, and it will work. So here I set the stop to false. The bundle will become slightly bigger because it now has the JSON plugin and the text plugin. There, hello world. All right, so that's basically what I had for the presentation. I've listed a couple of resources, such as the documentation, which is on the Aurelia Hub. I've also pushed all the demos that I've used in this presentation to GitHub, so if you want to take a look how I did it, you can take a look, find it there. If you have any questions, issues, or those kind of things, feel free to open an issue in the CLI repository, or send me a message with Gitter, or send me an email. That's all fine. So yeah, are there any questions? Not even those that are not related to the presentation.
I have one not related.
Yeah.
What kind of shortcut did you use to select those two Boolean values?
Which values?
What kind of shortcut in VS Code did you use to select those two Boolean values at the same time?
Oh, right, yeah, it's the Alt key. It's a very nice trick, I'll show you. So you can say, click here, hold Alt, click there, and you can change multiple lines at once.
Okay, that's nice.
And
it's kind of like in Visual Studio, but different.
Yeah, it's even crazier, because you can do this, and then select these, and then it is different per line that you selected.
That's nice.
If you have something selected, you can also press Ctrl D, it will select the next thing, and it will get cursors everywhere. To make sure you break something in the code.
Right, any other questions? No? Yeah.
What do you have on the roadmap for this?
Yeah, we're going to add build targets for Electron and a bunch of mobile applications. So you can use the same application code, but in an Electron application, in a mobile application. Anyway, that's the idea. We still have to get started on that. But it will be pretty awesome, because you can build the application for web and for Electron and for a mobile application all at once using the same application code. So that's going to be challenging, but hopefully very rewarding. So yeah, so that is one thing. And I really would like to improve the bundler. It's kind of tricky to configure the packages that you need to, you want to have included. Yeah, I would like it to make it easier so that it accepts any package, and yeah, so improving the bundler is one thing.
That's the AU import?
Maybe, but also the bundler itself. I mean, the AU install command that we have and the AU import commands are useful for creating the configuration, but I would like to make the bundler add features to it so it supports more packages. So for example, if you have a package that uses Node.js syntax and browser code in one file, CLI doesn't really like that. It would assume that the bundler changes the library's code for it to work. Like Webpack does that. Webpack modifies the code of the library so that it works in a browser environment, but the CLI doesn't yet. And I'd like to add that. So, yeah.
Is there an option to, after you've done the bundling, the bundles are written to a directory, that you can have a task that automatically copies it to another directory?
Sure. I mean, you have these Gulp tasks. So in here you have the build task. And this is basically the definition of that Gulp task. Here it says, okay, read the project configuration, which means, okay, load aurelia.json, start the bundler process. Then transpile all the source code, add the HTML files to the bundle, add the CSS files to the bundle, copy any files from one place to another, and write the bundles. So after the bundles have been written, you can say, okay, move the files or copy the files, because when this has been executed, the bundles are written, so you can copy them to wherever you like. But depends on what you want. I mean, if you don't want to use the scripts folder, then you might be better off just telling the CLI where to output the bundles. Okay, good. All right.
Any more questions?
Yeah.
So if I have my existing project which doesn't use Aurelia CLI but just plain Gulp
Right.
with all the tasks, how much work would it be to upgrade it to Aurelia.json, and should I do it?
Yeah, depends on your application, but yeah, how many packages do you use? How difficult are your Gulp tasks? Those kind of things.
It's more or less the same set of tasks like you.
Yeah. I mean, if you just copy over your source code and your unit tests, I don't see why it wouldn't work. You just have to add the packages to the Aurelia.json file. Once that is in, it should be fine. Yeah.
The installation, you still have to install them using npm and then add them via the CLI, or is that already combined?
No, you have to. Yeah, you have to do an npm install so that it downloads the package to node modules, and then you have to tell the CLI how to bundle that package, and that you do in the Aurelia.json file. So, for example, here I tell it how to bundle jQuery, and you have to do that for that package that you installed. We do have the au install command, so you can do au jQuery, and that will au install jQuery, sorry. And that will do an npm install, and it would configure it for you in Aurelia.json. It does that in a single command. But that is, yeah, it doesn't always create the correct configuration. So most of the times it's fine, but sometimes it doesn't find exactly the right configuration, because it's pretty difficult to support all packages, because all packages do things differently. Like some packages use the dist folder as the distribution, some packages don't. So it does a pretty good job, but it may not work for all packages.
You can also set it up to use yarn, I believe, right? If you don't like npm, you can set it up to use yarn.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, yeah. You can specify a property on your package manager. And then when you do an au install, instead of using npm, it will use yarn, which is a bit quicker. Does that answer your question? Okay. All right.
Let's give a big applause.
Yeah.